All right, good afternoon, everybody. We have a lot of questions today, so before we start, I just want to just go over a couple of house rules. We'd like to stick to one question, one follow-up, to be respectful to everybody that has questions today, because there is a lot of them. We will start with four in the room, we'll head to the phones, and then we'll come back to the room as well, just so we can get everybody. Go ahead, Premier.
Well, thank you, everyone. We would have been here 15 minutes earlier, but we had an unexpected event in the legislature today. I do want to welcome you, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to be here on this exciting day. Today marks a new dawn for Alberta, for Canada, and for the federation that binds us together into one great nation. Canadians take pride in the fact that our nation is a mosaic and not a melting pot, both culturally and in terms of our government. Canada's provinces and territories are part of a larger whole, but are not subordinate to it. As Albertans, we love our Canada deeply. This is our home, and we are honored to be contributing members. But the way Ottawa has treated the province, most especially Alberta, is unacceptable. Albertans are demanding action to restore a relationship that respects Alberta's sovereign areas of provincial jurisdiction as defined by the Constitution. The Canadian Constitution was intended to create a respectful union where the provinces would have their own areas of jurisdiction, free from interference, with autonomy over the laws and policies within their provinces' own spheres of influence. Yet this nation has not always operated smoothly. Over the years, there have been a shamefully large number of missed opportunities for shared growth and prosperity between the provinces and the federal government. In particular, a long and painful history of mistreatment and constitutional overreach from Ottawa has for decades caused tremendous frustration for Albertans. In response, we are finally telling the federal government, no more. It's time to stand up for Alberta. Bill 1, the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, is a first step in standing up for Albertans and pushing Ottawa back into its own lane. When passed, this legislation will create a constitutional legal framework for Alberta to push back against federal interference and encroachment. The federal government is actively attempting to landlock our natural resources, penalize our energy and agriculture producers, cut fertilizer use, control the delivery of health, education, childcare, and other social programs with strings-attached funding, and confiscate legally owned firearms. And that's just a few examples. The framework provided under the Act will allow Alberta's Legislative Assembly to identify constitutional concerns with a specific federal program or piece of legislation, and then recommend a measured and appropriate response to prevent or frustrate that federal intrusion. Our province will not enforce unconstitutional or harmful Ottawa policies or laws in Alberta. Albertans come first, always. Importantly, this Act fully respects Indigenous and treaty rights, the Constitution, court decisions, and does not force private citizens or companies to do anything contrary to federal law or policy. It's intended to be fully democratic and transparent. Each proposed use of the Act will require a special motion to be passed in the Legislative Assembly, which will be subject to open discussion, examination, and review. This framework is both a useful tool and a call to action. It is intended to be used selectively, thoughtfully, and towards the goal of fighting federal initiatives which would harm our province, our people, and our prosperity. We expect to table a number of special motions under this Act in the upcoming spring legislative session, dealing with the examples of federal overreach that I just mentioned earlier. Let it be clear, nothing in this bill involves separation, nor does it provide a means to accomplish such ends. Rather, it is a way for this great province to hold the federal government accountable to the constitutional principles that serve as the very foundation of our country's governance. We are proud Canadians, and we are committed to building a strong and united Canada, but we cannot do that from a position of weakness. We must do that from a position of strength that the principles of our Constitution have provided us. Alberta and Canada are both worth fighting for, and that fight is with an out-of-control federal government in Ottawa that sees Alberta and all provinces as its subordinate rather than its partner. We must push back and take a stand. We must protect the rights of Albertans and our great province, and we must stand up for what is right. Thank you, and I now invite the Justice Minister to speak.
It's ready almost.
2 more days.
That's not the only one. 2 more days. 2 more days. Are you keeping yours? Well, thank you very much, everyone. And as Premier Smith said, Albertans are proudly Canadian. We sing our national anthem, we cheer our national sports teams, and we contribute our resources and our talents to the benefit of the whole. At the same time, Albertans are proudly and uniquely Albertan. We have our own local priorities, interests, and freedoms. And we want to make sure that Alberta's voice is heard in ensuring that Albertan concerns are addressed. From the very start of Confederation, the House of Lords made it clear that the object of the laws which created Canada were neither to weld provinces into one, nor to subordinate provincial governance to a central authority. Canada was to have a federal government that represented all and would be entrusted with the administration of those items in which everyone had a common interest. But each province retained its own independence and autonomy. Our courts have likewise made it clear that provinces do not occupy a lesser position to the federal government, and that the principles of federalism are a political and legal response to the underlying political realities, social realities, and diversity of our nation. Now, for a long time, the federal government hasn't respected this division of powers. They have continued to encroach into Alberta's rightful jurisdiction. They have continued to demand that we do their bidding. And they have continued to add terms and conditions to their funding of what should be provincial programs, all of which continue to cause harm to our province, our people, and our prosperity. And this is why we have introduced the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Bill, which is a framework on how our province will take a strong stance against federal government overreach and interference in areas which are properly within our rightful jurisdiction. Albertans expect and demand that the federal government respect the federal-provincial division of powers. Sometimes they don't. And when they don't, we need to do more than simply point out that they are overstepping their authority. We need strong action. The Constitution of Canada intentionally distributed powers between the federal government and the provinces. We are supposed to be equal partners, respecting the spheres of authority granted to each other in order to best serve our respective communities and to best address their respective needs and priorities. This proposed legislation provides us with a sound legal framework and a democratic and constitutional approach for asserting Alberta's jurisdiction, rights, and freedoms. The Act sets out a transparent process that must be followed before Alberta's government can issue any directions or actions pursuant to it. This process will ensure that any use of the Act reflects the will of the Legislative Assembly, the will of Albertans, and is in line with the Constitution. I'd like to outline for you the steps that would be taken in relation to using this piece of legislation. The Premier or any minister would introduce a motion for a resolution on how they propose to use the Act. This motion would identify a federal matter. This could be a federal program or a federal piece of legislation as being either unconstitutional or causing harm to Albertans, and would propose steps for Cabinet to take. The Legislative Assembly would then debate the proposed resolution, and the resolution would pass only if the majority of MLAs voted in favor of it. If the motion doesn't pass, the resolution would fail, and the proposed use of the Act wouldn't take place. If the motion does pass, the resolution would succeed, and Cabinet would then decide what specific steps or actions the province should take in response to the federal government's overreach. The steps or actions taken would depend entirely on the motion passed and on what Cabinet believes would be most effective as a means to ensuring that the federal government does not overstep its authority. Now, no matter what the particular steps or actions in response may be, they would have to meet all applicable constitutional and legal requirements. Cabinet could, for example, decide to change any provincial enactments. This could include amending legislation, regulations, or other orders in order to assert provincial jurisdiction. Cabinet could also give specific directives to, and this is from the legislation, quote, provincial entities and to the Crown, such as specific ministers, end quote. And these provincial entities include schools, most public post-secondary learning institutions, municipalities, and municipal police services. The Act would only allow Cabinet to issue orders in council which are constitutional. That is to say, directives which fall within provincial legislative jurisdiction. If the use of the act against a federal program or federal piece of legislation was approved by the Legislative Assembly and later challenged in court, the Alberta government would respect the court's decision. Nothing in this bill changes the government's commitment to Canada and our respect for the rule of law. Rather, this bill is a clarion call for the provinces to assert our constitutionally mandated rights and jurisdiction. We note that our neighboring province of Saskatchewan has introduced the Saskatchewan First Act in its legislature. Although the proposed Saskatchewan First Act is very different from the proposed Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act in terms of its contents and its approach, both pieces of legislation are similarly aimed at affirming provincial authority and resisting federal overreach. We're proud to be among the first provinces to build a growing movement centered around respect for constitutional rights and freedoms. Now, for many years, Albertans have voiced concerns about growing federal overreach and intrusion into matters of provincial jurisdiction. Your provincial government has heard you loud and clear. Albertans can be assured that their provincial government already possesses the will to fight for and to protect their rights, their interests, their freedoms, and their prosperity. And this proposed framework, the Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Bill, will provide us with the necessary tools to do so. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Premier, can I ask you, I would think the main concern with this bill would be you're granting your cabinet the power to sort of decide what a harmful act is, and then to grant yourselves the power to rewrite laws unilaterally behind closed doors. How is that? Is that not an overreach? Is that not a dangerous precedent to be setting here?
You may just want to review the comments from the Justice Minister, because what he said is that Cabinet gets to identify those issues, and then we would bring it forward in the legislature for a full and open debate. So no, nothing takes place behind closed doors. We want this to be public. We want it to be very clear that when we believe the federal government is violating our rights, that we will have a fulsome debate on it. And that's the reason why we put this mechanism in place.
Okay, that's a bit different from, I guess, at least from what I heard in the tech briefing. So let's say that.
Do you want to go and talk to the Justice Minister? Because I think you.
Albertans want to hear from you, Premier, but
Well, but I
whatever
think
you
you
want to
must
do.
understand, so maybe we need some clarity.
Okay, so let's say you have problems with the Health Act. There should be no strings attached. So you put out a resolution to say, we're not going to have, we're going to fight back against that. So now Cabinet grants itself, as I understand it from the tech briefing, you now have powers as Cabinet to start rewriting health-related laws to push back. I didn't hear anything about, in the tech briefing, about having to come back to the ledge for that. That's a resolution. But you get, once the resolution's passed, Cabinet gets to do whatever it deems fit.
But the most important difference between this piece of legislation that's proposed and Section 52.1 that used to be in the Public Health Act is that those emergency powers did occur in a closed room in Cabinet. This is only going to happen after there is an open and democratic debate and vote in the Legislative Assembly first. That's the biggest difference. So this is, as Premier said, going to be more public.
Following that, you get your marching orders from the resolution, and then
Recommendations.
you get to do, yes, recommendations, and then you get to do whatever you want in what you feel is the service of this resolution.
In accordance with the
So-
directives in the resolution.
No, but that's the problem. You're the ones that are going to interpret those directives, and you're the ones who are going to make the changes, and it's not clear to me who gets to oversee that. So you're going to be rewriting laws based on this resolution, based on how you interpret this resolution, and I don't know where the oversight is on that.
The
And-
Legislative Assembly.
Well, on the resolution, Minister, but how do people know? Like, let's say, okay, well, you know what, I think this Health Act should be changed to push back. Well, maybe we should do this Health Act too. Well, and this piece too. All of a sudden, you've got Cabinet rewriting all kinds of laws with no oversight. I mean, if I'm wrong, please explain it to me.
Well, the boundaries are because it would have to fit within the directives in the
Based on
resolution.
how you interpret it. That's the problem. Who's guarding the guards, I guess, is always the problem.
The Assembly. The Assembly is.
Audrey, go ahead.
So just to be sure I understand, because I also am confused about that. You will have a motion that sets out, what the Cabinet can do. You will go to Cabinet, decide what you want to do, but will you be restricted to what was decided in the motion? Or can you take steps that are not specifically written in that motion?
The question is, when there's a motion, the motion can be if the minister brings forward, any member of executive council brings forward a resolution, then it's for the assembly to vote on and debate at that time. Is that what you're asking about?
No, not specifically, but I'll give a hypothetical just to make it clear. Let's say you have a motion, it's adopted, it says, let's say the health minister can rewrite X law. He goes, he does that, but can he go further? Can he take other actions that are not specified in the motion?
Well, first of all, it's going to start with a motion that is going to say that it's in the opinion of the assembly that the federal government has a program or some sort of initiative, some piece of legislation or proposed legislation that is in the opinion of the assembly to be unconstitutional or causing harm to Albertans. So it's got to start with that. So this isn't just an opportunity for the assembly or cabinet to start making emergency changes to legislation like that. That's not what's contemplated here. We would be looking at, first of all, the assembly debating, is this unconstitutional? Is it causing harm to Alberta? And then, in the opinion of the assembly, directives to cabinet or executive council on what to do next. Your question is, how far would they be able to go? Well, look, if it says, first of all, that everything, all the steps and how this piece of legislation is to be interpreted is constitutional. So for cabinet to all of a sudden start making changes that weren't included in that directive, I don't see that being the case.
Okay, just to be 100% clear, the cabinet will only be able to act within what was defined in the motion and nothing more.
Well, if they decided to do more, then I would suggest that, I mean, this is hypothetical. This is hypothetical that's suggesting, would there be a future cabinet that would try to go further than the resolution? I suppose that's up to the assembly at that time to hold that executive council to account. I don't see that being included in what's proposed to the assembly.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Why do you need the power to rewrite laws without going through the legislature?
We need the power to reset the relationship with Ottawa. That's what this is all about. We've tried different things in the past and it hasn't worked. So we've got to try something new. And I must tell you, I believe it's already working. And the proof of that is the most recent COP27 final resolution that came forward. And if you look at Minister Stephen Guilbeault's comments about why he did not support that, he said it's because in Canada, natural resources are provincial jurisdiction. And if he signed on to a resolution to phase out oil and natural gas, he would face a legal challenge from the provinces that Ottawa would not win. Now, this is not language I've ever heard out of Stephen Guilbeault, but I think it goes to the work that our Environment Minister, Sonia Savage, has done in helping to educate Ottawa that we are not a subordinate level of government, that we want...
Explain why you need this power. Like, what is so urgent that you would use what is normally an emergency power to skip around the legislature to put
Because we've been
the finer
ignored.
point on it?
We've been ignored for 10 years. The former Premier, Rachel Notley, tried the Climate Leadership Plan to get a better relationship with Ottawa. It failed. Former Premier Jason Kenney tried to have a collaborative relationship with Stephen Guilbeault in Quebec to get LNG export. It failed. We put forward an equalization referendum to try to start a conversation to change the relationship with Ottawa. It failed. So now we're going to try something new. I think we've got their attention. We've got their attention because I know with the relationship that we're now seeing develop with the federal government, finally recognizing that they cannot pass carte blanche power over our natural resources, that they have recognized our industrial pricing program around industrial emissions for CO2, that they have accepted that natural resources fall within our jurisdiction. I think that begins a constructive relationship, and that's what this was all about. You do not have that relationship change without a push. This was a push. And here's the point. I hope we never have to use this bill. I hope that we've sent a message to Ottawa that we will vigorously defend our constitutional areas of jurisdiction, and they should just butt out. They should work collaboratively with us on areas where we have common cause, and I'm hoping that we're beginning to see a change in that relationship. That's the reason you put forward a piece of legislation like this. It's the reason why Scott Moe put forward a similar piece of legislation, which incidentally, the NDP in Saskatchewan are supporting, because they are also realizing that you've got to put Saskatchewan first. We are putting Alberta first, and I would invite the NDP to join us in supporting this bill for that exact reason.
Okay, one more and then I have to go to the phone lines.
That doesn't answer the fundamental question here. You can say that Alberta has failed to get what it wants from Ottawa in the past, so you need to go further. Okay. But that doesn't explain why you need to change the law, you need to give cabinet the power to change the law without going through the House. Why not?
You're
Why
misunderstanding.
not go through the House?
We are going through the House. I mean, I certainly listened to the Justice Minister's comments. Maybe you, as I said, maybe you might want to re-listen to them. The motion would have to go in through the legislature, and there would have to be a motion of the legislature that passes. Our process internally for developing policy is we now have cabinet policy committees that private members are on and chair, and then it goes through our cabinet, and then it goes on to legislative review committees. So any policies that would come out of that motion would go back to the Legislative Assembly. That's the whole purpose of the Legislative Assembly. It's the whole purpose of creating a piece of legislation that gives that ultimate accountability. I can tell you the two things I'm paying most close attention to right now. And these are two things that Sonia Savage has already put on the radar screen of the federal government. Number one is that they came through during our leadership race with a very aggressive, targeted approach on emissions that would cap our emissions from oil and natural gas 42% by 2030. Now, we know that if you have an emissions cap and you have too short a time frame, and you do not have the technological capacity to reach that target, it is effectively a production cap. And she has already indicated to the federal government that would be a violation of our constitutional rights under Section 92A to develop our resources. Same thing with the fertilizer. They wanted an emissions reduction of 30% in a similarly absurd period of time with no technological ability to achieve it. An emissions cap that is not practically achievable in that period of time is a de facto production cap. And is also a violation of Section 92A of the Constitution, giving us the right to develop our natural resources. Now, we put those on the table, and we hope that the federal government will work collaboratively with us, knowing that we are watching these two pieces of legislation, and we've identified those as ones that would be very problematic if they tried to pass them. So that's the reason why we put it forward. It begins the conversation with Ottawa so that they do not continue to pass aggressive policy targeted specifically at our industry and specifically at our development of our natural resources. That is not the way the country's supposed to work. And so we're helping to educate them and the rest of the country about that.
Lisa, do you have a follow-up?
Legislation right now, I'm looking at the wording of the legislation, Premier, and can you tell me where in this legislation that it says that once a resolution is passed by the Legislative Assembly and it goes to Cabinet and Cabinet amends legislation, that it goes back to the Legislative Assembly? I don't see that in the wording of the bill. So can someone direct me to where that is? Anyone?
Frank, I don't know if I can oppose on you, maybe Frank. This is a question about.
Maybe to clarify this, are you arguing that because the resolution goes through the legislature first, that's the only oversight that it needs in the legislature? That once, that the cabinet will be held to that motion, to that resolution, after the fact? Is that what you're saying?
After the fact, so this all begins with a resolution in the assembly, so yes, that's it, okay, so, but, sorry, your question again then, sorry, and then there's two questions here that we're answering.
That is the oversight, that is the legislative oversight, is the resolution goes to the House. Period, full stop.
It doesn't
Then
go back.
It doesn't go back to the House after that to change legislation.
Well, it could always go back to the House to amend the resolution, the minister can always go back and have another resolution.
Minister, the point is, we had a tech briefing with officials. We asked this question directly. We said that once the motion's debated in the legislature and the majority of MLAs vote on it, and then it goes to cabinet and there's directives within that motion, then the cabinet ministers have the ability to unilaterally, if they so choose, change legislation. We asked that, we confirmed that over and over with officials. So can you just say yes or no, that's correct, and if it's not, explain why it's not?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, after the assembly, but then, Michelle, you had a different question about that, though.
Yeah, I'm looking at section 4 that talks about the powers of the Lieutenant Governor and Council. And it says nothing. It talks about directives, right? Issuing a directive to a provincial entity and its members, direct a minister to exercise power, duty, or function of the minister. And then, if the Lieutenant Governor and Council is satisfied that doing so is in the public interest, direct a minister responsible for an enactment as designated under Section 16 of the Government Organization to, by order, suspend or modify the application or operation of all or part of an enactment subject to the terms and conditions the Lieutenant Governor and Council may prescribe or specify and set up provisions that apply in addition to or instead of any provision of an enactment. So tell me what part of this says that after you guys make a decision on this in cabinet, maybe changing the law, that it goes back to the Legislative Assembly. I don't see it here.
No, not that it goes back, but they're held, I mean, we are a subset and accountable to the assembly as an executive council.
You're making laws behind closed doors, Minister, that's the issue. You're changing laws behind closed doors.
It is beginning with, this is the important difference, Michelle. This is the important difference. It begins with an open and democratic debate in the assembly
That's not how
by
it works.
resolution.
Okay,
of
we
the
have to head to
assembly.
the phone lines. Let's put the first reporter through, please.
Thank you, Rick Bell, Calgary Sun.
Good afternoon. I'm going to ask a different question because I think you've now finally answered the question, which is that once the resolution is passed, it goes to cabinet, cabinet gets to change the laws, and then you're off to the races. I mean, that's how I'm hearing it. I think that's pretty obvious now that that's what that is. So I'm going to go on to another one, which is contained in the your own document talks about the federal government and whether there's a possibility the federal government could disallow this act. Now, it says in the document, your document that we received, while we do not know for certain, we believe the scenario is unlikely. Well, that's your bet. But what happens if there are rumblings to do this from the federal government and they just step in and say, and shut you down? You obviously have some sort of a contingency plan for if that were to happen. So, Premier Smith, what would you do if the government, the federal government, comes in and disallows this act?
I'm not anticipating they will. I'm actually anticipating that this is going to start a very productive conversation with the federal level of government about our joint interests and how we can achieve them together. And I think that we've already seen that there have been some positive developments. We are able to work collaboratively with the federal government on areas where we're able to take the lead. But I think that this is the most important part of this legislation is sending the message to Ottawa that like Quebec, we are going to vigorously defend our constitutional areas of jurisdiction. And so I guess the ball will be in the federal government's court. We'll see how they respond to this. But I'm anticipating from what I've seen so far that they're getting re-educated on what it means to have a constitution that has two different sovereign areas of jurisdiction, one federal and one provincial. We haven't been acting in our full area of sovereign jurisdiction. Now we are. So I'm hopeful that we don't ever have to invoke this legislation. I'm hoping that we will be able to find areas of common ground. That's the intention.
Just a supplementary, I know, but you've instructed your cabinet ministers, to review legislation, and there's a long laundry list here of where you may use it. We'll see where it goes, and maybe some people will applaud your optimism, but I think there was a Mike Tyson line, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the stomach or hit in the head. Surely you must have some idea of what would happen in what you see as the unlikely but not impossible scenario of Ottawa coming in and saying, and not being convinced and not being re-educated and maybe even seeking popularity in the rest of the country by doing it, who knows, on this issue. Surely you must have at least a plan of how, now in your document it says it would provoke an unprecedented constitutional crisis. So maybe you could talk about what would happen if Ottawa were to do this, in the unlikely case, but still possible.
Well, I think ultimately these things will get battled out in the court. I mean, part of the issue when we say we're putting this up as a shield is that Ottawa invades our jurisdiction, passes legislation, and then forces us to go to court to get our rights back. So what we are doing is putting up a shield saying, no, we're going to protect our constitutional jurisdiction, and then they can take us to court and try to argue why it is that they should violate the Constitution and invade our areas of sovereign power. I think that we all recognize that the courts are ultimately the arbiter of these kinds of things, and we're just reversing the onus. So I would imagine that that's how it would proceed.
Okay, operator, next journalist, please. Operator, next caller, please.
No one else federal or no one else online?
There's a few.
Can we jump in? Thank you.
Operator? Are you there?
I have a
State-
quick question.
yeah, okay, go ahead.
Green Western Standard.
Okay.
Kelly, please stand by. It sounds like they're having some difficulty in the room.
Okay, we'll just go to the room and,
In the technical briefing, like you talk about harmful things that could happen, there's no definition of harmful in the wording of the bill. Who determines what's harmful and what's not? Because like what I think is harmful, someone else mightn't think that is harmful as well, so.
Well, I can give you an example. I mean, when I hear from our business leaders that if the federal government came through with this emissions reduction cap to reduce emissions 42% by 2030, that I'm told that it would cause devastation to their share value. That seems pretty harmful to me. It would make it very difficult for them to attract foreign investment. That seems pretty harmful to me. We've already had a federal government who, because of their actions, have caused at least $150 billion worth of investment to be chased away. Same thing, you talk to our farmers. I mean, you could talk to frontline stakeholders and ask them what the implication would be of having to do a 30% reduction in fertilizer use and the impact that would have on food production. I don't think it's not a mystery on those two examples that those are going to have a devastating effect on our industry and that it's unconstitutional because it violates our rights to manage our own resources. So I think that we're not going to be looking for arcane fights to pick. We're going to make sure that the issues that we choose are substantive because the harm is not just a potential, it's real. And so those are the two things, as I mentioned, that I'm watching very closely to see if we have to take action.
I have a question right here.
just to follow up, and then we'll go to you as our
Just
final
at the
question.
end of the technical briefing, it was mentioned that the RCMP falls under the contractors. In the wording.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
At the end of the technical briefing, we were just given a clarification that the RCMP also falls under the contractors section of the wording of the bill.
So, well, the RCMP are a vendor for provincial policing. The agreement that we have with the RCMP makes it clear that they are a federal entity. But if there was an issue where some action needed to be taken, I suppose a direction could be made to the public safety minister for a direction within, still having to comply with the PPSA, the Provincial Policing Services Agreement that we have with Canada. That's perhaps where the answer was coming from in the technical briefing.
Go ahead.
Hi, Premier Smith. Celine Gellis here with Rebel News. You had previously announced to protect the vaccination status in the Alberta Human Rights Code. You've backed off that plan for this sitting, but lives are still on the line. Annette Lewis was denied a transplant because of her vaccination status, and she will die without it. Does your government have plans to address this medical coercion?
I am seeking a second opinion on that particular case, and I know that there is at least one other case as well. So as soon as I have a result from that, I will let you know. But on the general issue, I've been pretty clear that we do not want to see discrimination against anybody on the basis of their booster status or their vaccination status. And I'm hopeful that the business community and other entities operating in this province have heard that message loud and clear, and will make sure to bring their policies into alignment with that objective.
Do you have a timeline for this? Because I feel like it is a very time-sensitive matter.
The difficulty with transplant patients is that they do have a protocol they go through to determine who has the best likelihood of survivability, and so that's why I need to have a second medical opinion. I don't want to supersede that, so I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to get an opinion in the matter of a number of weeks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.